Hello and welcome. Welcome to this episode of Herman Bavinck's Generous Theology. We have a lot to consider today, so let's get into it. First slide. Last time, we noticed that Bavinck had detailed in his Reformed dogmatics a step or a procedure, a process from the old pre-Enlightenment religious ways of thinking to this new, enlightened, secular ways of thinking. And that this impetus was from this new field of psychology, 19th century psychology. And so the psychologists here created this new secular science of comparative religion. And what they did was they classified religious thought into genus and species and accounted for religious beliefs by surveying religious populations. And this was, of course, an approach and method that was contra addressing the scholarly literature that was associated with that religion. Next slide. And so these new group of psychologists offered a narrative. They offered a storyline. And it went like this. Religious thought, they thought, was atavistic. That is to say, it was primitive, it was a throwback, or it was something vestigial. And the psychologists thought that the religious mind corresponded to a child's mind. It was impressionable, gullible. That it was open for thoughts and beliefs to be externally imposed upon it. And the psychologists contrasted their new, enlightened, secular mind, and they established it as a more mature, a more adult way of thinking. That is, there were new passions, a new thirst for autonomy, as well as valuing in this independent, critical thinking. And so we have the narrative intensified and emphasized of blind faith versus science. Next slide. And so what has this movement become in the years since Bavinck analyzed it? Where is this new secular narrative in the culture today? What has it developed into? And I think it's worth noting this important period of time from about the year roughly 2000 to about 2015. And this period we can call the new atheism in the West. And it really was an era in which the ending of the goodwill that theists and non-theists had toward each other in the West occurred. That is to say, there was little new about the new atheism per se, not particularly new arguments, not a particularly new metaphysic or way of thinking about things. However, while the arguments and methods were largely the same, there really was a difference in how these arguments were received. And so prior to the year 2000, a biblical literacy, even among non-believers, and respect for Christianity as a force for good in society was high. But after this period, this new atheism period, maybe after the year 2000 or so, there was a significant or a large increase in the influence of non-Christian thought in society, a decrease in the reverence that people had for biblical literacy and Christian themes. Next slide. So what has the movement become, and where is the new secular narrative at? Well, one thing that's worth noting is that, of course, massive Christian failures made it very easy for people during this time of the new atheism to demagogue, to accuse believers of things. And so this predates even the new atheism strictly, in a strict sense. You can even go back to before the 1980s, in which There were schisms where the Christian body was divided into these warring, caustic factions. So you can think of one group of Christians warring against the other group, which was warring against a third group, and still another fourth group was warring against all the others. And of course, we have the era of the televangelists in the 1980s and 1990s. And while it would not be fair to characterize all of televangelism this way, there was absolutely a narrative that built up and developed around this idea of a slick, moralizing televangelist who, as he points and shakes his bony finger of condemnation, is secretly committing all of the sins that he himself rails against. In that same time, society's earlier warts became associated with Christianity. And so all of the injustice, all of the bad things that happened in the West, in the Christian West, for the past several hundred years, became integrally linked with the Christian religion. And Christians were seen as on the wrong side of history. And so you can think here, for example, about ideas of authority. You can think of ideas about women's rights and treatment, LGBT issues, social justice in the Marxist sense. This was also a period in which we saw the weaponization of science and this emergence of something called consensus science, in which groups of people issuing conclusions that they labeled scientific and used as a trump card, and they also used these narratives to advance public policy. Next slide. And so, as a believer, we have to consider that when it comes to this analysis, there's some truth to what the opposition has had to say. Green wood, the saying goes, doesn't burn. And demagogy usually has a grain of truth to it. And it's that bit of truth that makes the step into overstatement seem so natural and easy. However, eventually, the caustic skeptic who is pointing out and criticizing eventually goes too far and falls into an unhealthy partisanship and demagogy. And here I would like to bring up this idea of journalistic integrity. And so 50 years ago, there were newspapers of record that printed and offered also news anchors on television. And the news they presented was highly regarded. And so I'll just name one particular name here. Earlier on, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, the New York Times was one of the nation's newspapers of record, meaning that it was highly regarded and tested and approved and held up to the highest levels of journalistic integrity. However, in this new period of aggressiveness, today's New York Times can't even be said to be up to the level of tabloid journalism. How the mighty have fallen. And in the effort to end Christianity, its critics have overplayed legitimate concerns. Next slide. And so we want to give just one example here from an interesting read from a book I would recommend for your library, Everybody is Wrong About God by James A. Lindsay. Lindsay is a powerfully astute observer of the human condition and has very insightful things to say. And yet, when he criticizes religion, he falls right into the practices and errors that Bavinck outlined 120 years ago regarding the new science of psychology. And so from the book's description on the book flap, it says this: with every argument for theism long since discredited, The result is that atheism has become little more than the noises reasonable people make in the presence of unjustified religious beliefs. Thus, engaging in interminable debate with religious believers about the existence of God has become exactly the wrong way for non-believers to try to deal with misguided and often dangerous belief in a higher power. The key, author James Lindsay argues, is to stop that particular conversation. Next slide. The description continues. He demonstrates that whenever people say that they believe in God, they are really telling us that they have certain psychological and social needs that they do not know how to meet. Lindsay then provides more productive avenues of discussion and action. Once non-believers understand this simple point and drop the very label of atheist, they will be able to change the way we all think about and talk about and act upon this troublesome notion called God. And so we see the new approach that Bavinck feared, that Bavinck detailed. We see it outlined here in Lindsay's work 120 years later. Next slide. So let's go in and take a look at some interesting points from Lindsay. And so Lindsay doesn't have a debate about the truth of the matter. He starts instead with the thesis that the debate has already occurred and the outcome has been already long decided. He says, with every argument for theism long since discredited. And then he argues that it is a moral wrong to even engage with believers. He even says that belief in a higher power is often dangerous. And so here we see this accusation that religious thought is not merely atavistic, that is to say primitive or vestigial, but it is in fact open harm. It is in fact harmful delusion, which was a conclusion of the secular new atheism in the early 2000s. And so Lindsay recommends the end of an era of cooperation and mutual respect. So he says it's no longer appropriate to interact with each other as equals and in a respectful way as we did pre-2000, but it's time for a new method. Next slide. Now there's some sense in which I agree with Lindsay in some specific and measured ways. So first of all, why dialogue with folks like Lindsay who don't want the dialogue? I am often surprised at the levels to which believers will sort of almost beg to have an interaction with a non-believer, even when it's clear the non-believer doesn't want the interaction. Why? Why force a conversation where one party does not wish to participate? Now, there has been a centuries-long engagement period between Christians and the secular brights in the Enlightenment. And I mean this in the best sense, not merely as a partisan Christian. And so Christians have had very profitable engagements interacting with Kantianism and the works of Hegel, in reading Marx, and speaking to people about the thought of Nietzsche and others. But while Christians, it seems, have played a full season on the opponent's home field, I'm not sure if we could conclude the courtesy is returned. It seems like the secular brights have not done the same thing. And so you read the works of many of these atheists or humanists or secularists, and I'm thinking here about, for example, Isaac Asimov or Carl Sagan or the four horsemen of the new atheism regarding Christian theology. And I note that other than to denigrate it and to speak about it in a bad sense as something that's already been defeated, which is the approach Lindsay takes, we have little to no investigation by the secularists into the deeper realms of Christian theology. Now, why should this be, I think, is an important question to ask. And let's take a quote here from a contemporary of Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and he says, "The next rational move is to consider the entire theistic enterprise beneath serious consideration." Lindsay spoke about in his work and said this: "Myths are culturally relevant narratives that simplify complex or unclear phenomena, and that speak to people at the level of their psychological needs. Narratives of this kind, though, are exactly what religions provide for people, and it is therefore precisely this observation that illustrates why God, at the center of so many religious beliefs, is a mythological construct." Now, this is a statement of Bavinck. This is a statement from Lindsay that Bavinck has anticipated 120 years ago. And you see here that Lindsay doesn't debate the merits of both sides and then arrive at a conclusion. He simply starts with a story. And the story goes like this: "There was a time when we were young and gullible and open to easy external manipulation and guidance, a time when we fell under the spell of external authority. But now we've moved. We've moved into a better and a higher way, where we think for ourselves and use critical thinking and science and reason." And so what's really important here is to realize Lindsay is not establishing a scientific conclusion that refutes or rejects or rebuts theism. He's simply adopting a form of product marketing that declares victory over it. He continues, "It is also necessary to pause and observe that the so-called new atheism succeeded. It won a key and decisive victory in an ongoing culture war about the roles of religion and faith in society. It defeated theism at the level of ideas and obliterated the taboo surrounding an open lack of belief in God, which was its main goal." Now, I'm not sure, of course, that I agree with Lindsay that theism was defeated in the marketplace of ideas, but I think it's important to note here, and I agree with him, that there really has been a change in society. He's really right in this analysis that the new atheism obliterated this taboo surrounding an open lack of belief in God. And I happen to agree. Prior to 2000, it was largely a negative or a pejorative to not be a believer. And now, in the post period after the new atheism, it's very clear that there's no particular penalty. Next slide. But interestingly enough, there are some very senses in which what James Lindsay says here is quite chilling. And so, in particular, it is the end of free speech as a core democratic value that is chilling. And this idea that cancel culture, even a soft cancel culture like Lindsay offers for here, implements a supra-judicial court of public opinion. And in the extreme, that's very little better than mob rule. And this idea of ostracism as a method of public policy, an ABC approach, as you will, where ABC means anything but Christianity, seems to produce an aggressive and cancerous society when it's adopted in corporate life, in government, in education, in entertainment. And so we really come to perhaps the largest concern associated with the new atheism, the ending of the taboo against atheism, and the deplatforming of traditional religion. And so my thesis, my contra point against Lindsay, is that his arguments seem to be little more than a form of intellectual hypergamy, in the sense that it seems to be a question. What is it? What do religious people even have to offer enlightened secular people? And the answer appears to be very little, if anything. And indeed, religion is painted in this new, under this new template as a form of intellectual racism. And so I read again from Lindsay's book that atheism has won still needs some defending. How could atheism have won the war of ideas if so many people still believe in God, including some who are very intelligent and highly educated? Put simply, wars of ideas are protracted affairs that are decisively won often long before everyone gets on board, sometimes decades sooner. Racism, to draw one notable example, is obviously still present in the United States, but few of us would deny that the idea of racism was defeated long ago. And so we have this idea from the civil rights era of the struggle against oppression, the struggle against religion as a form of intellectual racism. Next slide. Well, is it true? Perhaps is a good question to ask. Is Lindsay correct? Has the war already been fought and won? Well, let's take a moment and think about what exactly intellectual hypergamy is. So hypergamy is an anthropological condition. And it is this idea that the proud person finds it very hard or offensive to have to learn something from someone who they perceive as their social inferior. And so a humorous quote, I think, that illustrates an example of hypergamy. Garrison Keillor would close his radio shows with this quote. He would say, "That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average." And so, in a humorous fashion, Keillor notes the pride that the locals in his Lake Wobegon community have. And so here, Lindsay does a similar thing. You know, that's the news from the new atheism, where all the women are strong and the men are good looking and the children are above average, as opposed to the theistic people who are obviously lower in their racism. So there's a form of familiarity which breeds contempt. There is also sort of this university experience associated with it, a ticking off of the checklist. Oh yeah, I used to believe this, I used to believe that, but now I've gone through, I've had my experiences, I've researched and done the work, and now I can check off the boxes. And at the final end of this hypergamy, this will to dominate overtakes the will to understand. I think the open question to ask Lindsay and these new post-new atheism secularists, the question is, do religious people even have any place at the table in the marketplace of ideas? And we're going to see, and we've already seen to some degree, that atheists like Lindsay and Bogosian think the answer is no. And so we see just one example of this in a quote here. When it matters, alchemy has been left behind. And the same is now true for the idea of God. It is up to us to just realize it and then move forward. And if belief continues, and it will, we can work to help people learn to form a better understanding of the world than reliance upon faith and superstition. Does the theist have anything to offer Lindsay? Well, if he doesn't think so, the theist is beneath learning from. He's arguing from an inferior position. Next slide. And so now we see that the new atheism has been less about actually addressing the contents and having this open debate or interaction between theists and atheists, although to be fair, there were plenty of debates that happened. But we see here Lindsay focuses the narrative. Atheism is a form of freedom. The theistic condition is a sort of bondage or a slavery or a racism, perhaps. And the conversion to atheism, this idea of being born again, this anti-religion on the part of Lindsay and Bogassian and others, smells suspiciously religious. And in particular, this is narrative that Lindsay is offering. This is product marketing. This is not demonstrated science. From his work, Lindsay says, at the moment when it became a part of our cultural furniture to have the words God and delusion in neat juxtaposition, God as an idea no longer deserved to be given any serious consideration. It means that it is no longer seen as scandalous, that is to say, atheistic thought, having become instead an irrevocable part of contemporary culture. And then in the other quote, we note that Lindsay describes theism as a loss of intellectual credibility. And so we're back to our hypergamy and our pride here. Who has anything to learn from one's inferiors? Next slide. So, is it true? Has this happened? Is Lindsay correct? Has the war already been fought and won? Imagine going to a debate between atheist Andy versus Christian Kyle. The debate starts and Andy takes the stage and declares, the debate has already occurred, Kyle has lost. Science has disproved, the consensus of selected non-believing thinkers have shown that, and the results are in. Critical thinkers agree. Religion is defeated. I think if we went to such a debate, I think Christian Kyle could perhaps offer an objection, and shouldn't we also as audience members? And so we have ideas promoted here that sound scientific, that sound rational and even reasonable, but in fact are simply hypergamous narrative. Theism is beyond hope as an intellectual position. Much of the Holy Scriptures is out of step with scientific knowledge. Only the most thoroughly faithful can take it at face value. Apparently, straightforward questions only seem to have meanings, but it is not clear that they do. No, my friends, Lindsay has nothing to learn from his inferiors. Next slide. And so, is Lindsay fighting the fight of science? And perhaps he thinks so. But read his work and find that his proof is much more of a literary narrative, a development in theme, than it is a scientific conclusion. But it is not just Lindsay, although this is a great work to illustrate that. And it's not just in religious spheres where people reify and personalize science around their own interests. And so we see up here several examples of different headlines where I think the authors are doing something similar to what Lindsay has done. And so I'll read a few examples. The first one says, want to fall in love with your partner again? Science says to ask them these questions. And then we have The image in the bottom right corner. Science says regularly attending concerts makes you happier. And do you see how in these headlines, the shorthand notation reifies and personalizes science? It takes it from an abstract human endeavor into its own personal being that is making and offering these conclusions. The image on the left says, science says this is what being near the ocean actually does to your brain. And of course, the article goes into specifics. But I want to say this much. In each of these shorthand cases, something important is lost. Science makes no statements, for science is impersonal. And also, science is as much art as it is science. And further, science is built upon a layer of metaphysics. And so what we really have to face is that Lindsay and Curtin and the other authors in these other articles are simply confusing their own understanding and their own knowledge with something objective called science. And I love the thing in the middle, that the sign in the middle says, it has a picture of an atom with its nucleus and electrons orbiting it, and it says, because science says so, that's why. Next slide. And I think finally we have to ask ourselves if Lindsay and these others are perhaps going in the footsteps of other famous Enlightenment thinkers like Kant and Nietzsche and others, who seem to have enough hubris to suppose that practically no one prior to them had ever thought about their topics. So Lindsay says, everyone is wrong about God. Everyone? And of course, Kant said, everyone is wrong about metaphysics. Everyone? And of course, finally, Nietzsche opined that he was the first psychologist and the first to think clearly in this space. Really? How can people who are pioneers in reality learn from people who they perceive to be their inferiors? Thank you, Herman Bavinck, and thank you, James Lindsay. For Herman Bavinck's generous theology, this is Romans 9:18.